Imagine you are a Roman soldier standing on a narrow strip of dirt in central Gaul. Behind you, 80,000 Gallic warriors are trapped on a hilltop, starving, furious, and looking for any chance to break out and cut you down. In front of you, stretching across the hills and valleys as far as you can see, another army is marching toward your position. This one is even bigger. Some ancient sources put it at over 250,000 men. You are standing between these two forces, with nothing but a wall of wooden stakes and a trench full of sharpened branches between you and total annihilation. And the man who put you in this position, the man who decided this was actually a good idea, is Gaius Julius Caesar. This is the Battle of Alesia, and it should not have worked. But to understand how Caesar ended up sandwiched between two armies in the middle of Gaul, you have to go back a few years. By 52 before the Common Era, Caesar had been campaigning in Gaul for 6 years. He had marched his legions across what is now France, Belgium, parts of Germany, and even launched 2 expeditions across the English Channel into Britain. The man was relentless. Every summer brought new conquests, new tribes forced into submission, and new territory absorbed into the growing Roman sphere. Caesar was building a reputation back in Rome, and every victory in Gaul added to it. But the Gauls were not happy about any of this. Year after year, Roman legions burned their villages, took their grain, demanded hostages from their chiefs, and installed puppet leaders loyal to Rome. The tribes had fought back in scattered rebellions before, but they never managed to coordinate. That changed when a young Arvernian nobleman named Vercingetorix stepped onto the stage. Vercingetorix was not your typical tribal chieftain. He was charismatic, politically sharp, and he understood something that previous Gallic leaders had missed. You could not beat Rome by meeting their legions head-on in open battle. The Romans were too disciplined, too well-trained, and too experienced for that kind of fight. Instead, Vercingetorix developed a scorched earth strategy. He ordered Gallic tribes to burn their own crops, destroy their own villages, and deny the Romans any source of food or shelter. If Caesar's legions could not eat, they could not fight. It was brutal, but it was smart, and for a while, it worked. Caesar's army started struggling with supply lines. The Gauls torched granaries before the Romans could reach them. Foraging parties got ambushed in the forests and picked off by Gallic horsemen who knew every trail and river crossing in the region. Vercingetorix was picking the Romans apart without ever committing to a pitched battle, and the momentum of the entire Gallic revolt was building. Tribes that had been sitting on the fence started joining the rebellion. Even some tribes that had been allied with Rome switched sides. The Aedui, who had been one of Rome's most loyal Gallic allies for years, flipped to the rebel cause. That was a serious blow. When your strongest allies start defecting, you know the situation is getting out of hand. Vercingetorix was becoming the one thing the Romans feared most in Gaul, a unified enemy with a real strategy. Then came Gergovia. Caesar marched his legions to the fortified hilltop town where Vercingetorix had positioned his forces, and for one of the very few times in his career, Caesar lost. The assault on Gergovia went badly. Roman soldiers pushed too far up the slopes without proper support, got cut off, and were driven back with heavy casualties. Nearly 700 legionaries died, including 46 centurions. For an army that relied on its centurion corps, losing that many junior officers in a single engagement was devastating. These were the backbone of the Roman military, the experienced veterans who kept their men disciplined in the chaos of battle and led from the front. Losing 46 of them in a single afternoon sent shockwaves through the entire army. Caesar pulled back, and across Gaul the message spread fast. Rome could be beaten. The general who had seemed unstoppable for 6 years just got his nose bloodied at Gergovia, and now every tribe in the region was reconsidering its options. Chiefs who had been submitting to Rome quietly started gathering warriors. Those who had already joined the revolt felt vindicated. The revolt grew even larger, but Caesar was not the kind of man who stayed on his heels for long. After Gergovia, he regrouped, recruited Germanic cavalry mercenaries to bolster his forces, and went looking for Vercingetorix. The two armies clashed in a cavalry engagement where Caesar's Germanic horsemen mauled the Gallic cavalry badly. Vercingetorix, recognizing that his mounted forces had been shattered, made a decision that would change everything. He retreated with roughly 80,000 warriors to a hilltop fortress called Alesia. The town of Alesia sat on top of Mont Auxois, in what is now Burgundy, France. Picture a flat-top hill rising about 150 meters above the surrounding plains, with steep slopes on most sides and two rivers running through the valleys below. The plateau on top was large enough to hold the entire Gallic army, plus the civilian population of the town. It was a strong defensive position. Vercingetorix had supplies, he had the high ground, and he had walls that would be extremely costly for the Romans to assault directly. More importantly, he had sent messengers racing to every corner of Gaul calling for a massive relief army to come rescue him. His plan was simple: sit tight on the hilltop, wait for reinforcements, and then crush Caesar between two forces when the relief army arrived. The messengers carried urgent pleas to every tribe that had not yet committed to the revolt, demanding warriors, cavalry, and supplies for the liberation of Gaul. It was not a bad plan. In fact, it was probably the best play Vercingetorix had. But he was betting on one thing. He was betting that Caesar would not be crazy enough to try and besiege a hilltop fortress while 250,000 Gallic warriors marched toward his rear. Any rational commander would have recognized the danger and withdrawn to safer ground before getting pinned down. Caesar looked at Alesia. He looked at the terrain. He did the math on the enemy forces. And then he ordered his engineers to start building. What the Romans constructed over the next 3 weeks was one of the most ambitious military engineering projects in the ancient world. Caesar ordered the construction of a circumvallation, a continuous ring of fortifications that completely encircled the hill of Alesia. We are talking about roughly 18 kilometers of walls, trenches, watchtowers, and obstacles, forming an unbroken loop around the entire hilltop. Every Roman legionary, from veteran soldiers to fresh recruits, worked on the construction. These men were not just fighters. Roman legionaries were trained engineers who carried entrenching tools alongside their weapons. They could build a fortified camp from scratch in a single afternoon. And now Caesar was asking them to build something far more ambitious on a scale the ancient world had rarely seen. The inner fortification line included 2 trenches, each about 4.5 meters wide. The one closest to Alesia was filled with water diverted from the nearby rivers. Behind the trenches, the Romans built a 4 minutes high rampart topped with a wooden palisade and sharpened stakes angled outward. Watchtowers went up every 24 meters along the entire circuit. In front of the trenches, Caesar's engineers planted rows of sharpened branches hidden in pits, which the soldiers nicknamed lilies after the flower shape of the holes. They also hammered iron-barbed hooks into buried logs to rip apart anyone who tried to charge through the defenses. The entire thing was a kill zone designed to make any breakout from Alesia suicidal, and that was only half of it. When Caesar got word that the Gallic relief army was actually coming and that it was massive, he ordered a second ring of fortifications built facing outward. This was the Counterattack, and it was roughly 21 kilometers long. Same trenches, same stakes, same watchtowers, same booby traps, but this time pointing in the opposite direction, designed to stop an army attacking from outside. Caesar also had his men dig additional cavalry traps along the approaches, with 5 rows of sharpened branches concealed in staggered patterns so that anyone charging at the outer wall on horseback would have their mounts impaled before they got close enough to fight. Think about what this means. Caesar's roughly 60,000 Roman legionaries were now standing between 2 walls of their own construction. Inside the inner ring, 80,000 starving Gauls were waiting to break out. Outside the outer ring, a relief force that ancient sources claim numbered over 250,000 warriors was closing in. The Romans were outnumbered something like 5 to 1, trapped in a corridor of their own making with enemies on both sides. The total length of fortifications Caesar's men had built, inner and outer rings combined, stretched nearly 40 kilometers. That is roughly the distance of a modern marathon, and every meter of it had to be defended. Caesar's own officers must have thought he had lost his mind, but Caesar understood something about fortification warfare that most commanders of his era did not. Walls are force multipliers. A smaller army behind good fortifications can hold off a much larger force because the attackers have to funnel into kill zones, while the defenders can concentrate their strength at the points of contact. Caesar was not trapped between two armies. He had built himself a fortress inside a fortress, and he was daring the Gauls to come break it. They did not have to wait long. Inside Alesia, the food situation was getting desperate. Vercingetorix had 80,000 mouths to feed, and not enough grain to last more than a few weeks. The Gauls had not planned for a long siege, because the whole strategy depended on the relief army arriving quickly. But days turned into weeks, and the granaries emptied. According to some ancient accounts, the situation got so bad that a chieftain named Critognatus allegedly proposed that the besieged Gauls eat the bodies of those too old or weak to fight. Whether that actually happened or was Roman propaganda designed to paint the Gauls as savages is debatable, but the desperation was undeniably real. Warriors were rationing handfuls of grain per day. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Vercingetorix tried sending the civilian population of Alesia, women, children, and the elderly, out through the Roman lines, hoping Caesar would let them pass and free up food for his warriors. Caesar refused. He left the civilians stranded in the no-man's land between the hilltop and the Roman fortifications, exposed to the weather and with nothing to eat. It was cold, calculated, and effective. The sight of their own people starving in front of the walls put enormous psychological pressure on the Gallic defenders, and it sent a clear message to the relief army: hurry up, or your people die. Then the relief army arrived, and the fighting began. The first major assault came at night. The relief force attacked the outer Roman fortifications, while Vercingetorix launched a simultaneous breakout attempt from the hilltop against the inner walls. Roman soldiers were fighting on two fronts in the darkness, scrambling between positions, trying to plug gaps in their lines while arrows and javelins rained down from both directions. The noise must have been terrifying. Thousands of Gauls howling war cries, the crash of bodies against wooden palisades, the screams of men falling into pit traps filled with sharpened stakes. The Romans held, barely, but they held. Caesar had positioned his forces to respond to attacks on either side, and his centurions kept their men in line through sheer discipline and the knowledge that there was literally nowhere to run. If the walls fell, every Roman soldier in that corridor was dead. That kind of motivation focuses the mind. The Gauls pulled back to regroup, but they had learned something from the first assault. They had identified a weak point. On the northern side of the Roman fortifications, there was a section where the terrain made it impossible to complete the defensive ring properly. A hill prevented the Romans from extending their trench and wall system in a full curve, creating a gap that was defended by two legions positioned in a camp. But without the same depth of obstacles protecting the rest of the line. The Gallic commanders spotted this, and they sent their best warriors, 60,000 of them according to Caesar's own account, on a wide flanking march to hit this weak point from the outside, while the rest of the relief army and the Alesia garrison attacked everywhere else simultaneously. This was the moment the entire siege came down to. If the Gauls broke through that northern gap, they would pour into the Roman corridor from behind, and the entire fortification system would collapse like a house of cards. Caesar would lose his army, Gaul would be free, and the history of Western civilization would look very different. The Gauls hit the weak point hard. The two Roman legions defending the northern camp fought desperately, but they were being overwhelmed. At the same time, Vercingetorix launched another massive breakout from the hilltop, stretching the Roman defenders even thinner. Every section of wall was under pressure. Roman reserves were running out. Officers were pulling men from quieter sections and rushing them to the crisis points, but it was not enough. Caesar could see what was happening. He was riding along the inner wall, personally directing reinforcements, wearing his distinctive red cloak so his soldiers could spot him in the chaos. Ancient sources describe him appearing at the most critical points of the battle, rallying troops who were on the verge of breaking. When one section of wall looked like it might fall, Caesar showed up with fresh cohorts and personally led them into the fight, but the real crisis was at the northern gap. The 60,000 Gallic warriors were smashing into the Roman camp, and the defenders were buckling. Caesar sent his best general, Titus Labienus, with 6 cohorts to reinforce the position. He ordered Labienus to hold the line at all costs. If the position could not be held, Labienus was to pull his men out and counterattack. Those were the kind of orders you give when you know everything is on the line. And then Caesar played his final card. He gathered his last reserve cavalry, including those Germanic horsemen he had recruited earlier, and sent them on a wide ride around the outside of the fortifications. These were not Roman citizen soldiers. These were Germanic tribal warriors, massive men on heavy war horses who fought with a ferocity that terrified even seasoned legionaries. Caesar had hired them specifically because they were some of the best cavalry fighters in the known world, and he had been saving them for exactly this moment. While the Gallic warriors were focused on breaking through the northern camp, Caesar's cavalry came thundering into their rear, sweeping across the open fields behind the Gallic assault force. The effect was devastating. The Gallic assault force at the northern gap suddenly found themselves caught between Labienus and the Roman defenders in front, and Caesar's cavalry smashing into them from behind. The same trap that the Gauls had been trying to spring on the Romans all day long, being caught between 2 forces, was now happening to them. The Gallic warriors at the northern position broke and ran. Caesar's Germanic cavalry cut them down as they fled across the open ground. When the rest of the relief army saw their best troops being routed, panic spread through the ranks. The massive Gallic force that had seemed so overwhelming just hours earlier disintegrated. Warriors scattered in every direction, abandoning the siege and fleeing into the countryside. The relief army was finished. On the hilltop, Vercingetorix watched the relief force collapse. He knew it was over. The next day, he assembled his chieftains and told them he was willing to either be killed among them or surrender alive, whatever they decided. They chose to hand him over. The surrender of Vercingetorix is one of the most dramatic moments in ancient history. According to the ancient sources, the Gallic chieftain put on his finest armor, decorated his horse, and rode out of the gates of Alesia alone. He circled Caesar, who was seated on a platform in front of his assembled legions, and then dismounted, stripped off his armor, and sat at Caesar's feet in silence. Some accounts say he threw his weapons down at Caesar's feet. Others describe a more subdued scene. Either way, the message was clear. Gaul had fallen. Vercingetorix spent the next 6 years as a prisoner in Rome, paraded through the streets during Caesar's triumphal procession, and was then executed by strangulation in the Tullianum prison. It was the standard Roman treatment for defeated enemy leaders, and it was merciless. The Battle of Alesia effectively ended organized Gallic resistance against Rome. There were scattered uprisings in the following year, but nothing on the scale of Vercingetorix's revolt. The tribal confederation that had briefly united against Rome splintered back into its component parts, and Caesar's legions mopped up the remaining resistance with brutal efficiency. Gaul became a Roman province, and it would remain under Roman control for the next 500 years. The Gallic language faded. Roman roads, aqueducts, and cities transformed the landscape. Latin replaced the native Celtic tongues, and over the centuries, the culture that emerged from this conquest would eventually become the foundation of modern France. The very language spoken in Paris today traces its roots back to the Latin that Caesar's soldiers brought with them. For Caesar personally, Alesia was the crowning achievement of his military career. The conquest of Gaul made him fabulously wealthy. Ancient historians estimate he looted enough gold and silver to crash the precious metals market in Rome. He also gained a hardened veteran army of 10 legions personally loyal to him, soldiers who had fought beside him for nearly a decade and would follow him anywhere. The victory turned him into the most famous man in the Roman Republic. It also set the stage for the civil war that would follow. When the Roman Senate demanded Caesar disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen, he refused. In January of 49, before the Common Era, he crossed the Rubicon River with his army and marched on Rome itself. The Republic never recovered. Within a few years, Caesar was dictator of Rome, and within a few years after that, he was dead on the floor of the Senate, stabbed 23 times by men who feared he had become a king in all but name. But all of that came later. At Alesia, in the autumn of 52 before the Common Era, Caesar accomplished something that military strategists still study and argue about today. He took a situation that should have been impossible, surrounded on all sides by numerically superior forces, and turned it into a decisive victory through engineering, discipline, and sheer audacity. The double fortification at Alesia was not just clever tactics, it was a statement about what Roman military engineering could accomplish when pushed to its absolute limit. Modern archaeologists have excavated the site of Alesia at Alesia-sur-Rhine in Burgundy, and they have found physical evidence of Caesar's fortifications. The trenches, the lily pits, the post holes for the watchtowers, fragments of Roman weapons, and Gallic arrowheads embedded in the soil. It all matches what Caesar described in his own account, the Commentari de Bello Gallico. The man was not exaggerating. He really did build 2 concentric rings of military fortification in enemy territory in 3 weeks, while being stalked by an army of over 200,000 warriors. Archaeological digs in the 19th and 20th centuries confirmed the exact layout of the siege works, and aerial photography revealed the outlines of the trenches still visible in crop patterns across the fields. You can visit the site today. There is a museum, called the Museopark Alesia, and an interpretive center, where the remains of the Roman siege works are preserved alongside reconstructions of the fortifications. Standing on that hilltop, looking down at the fields where Caesar's legionaries dug their trenches and planted their stakes, it is hard not to feel the weight of what happened there. The quiet Burgundy countryside gives no hint of the carnage that took place on that same ground over 2,000 years ago. This was the place where one man's refusal to accept defeat reshaped the map of Europe. Whether you admire Caesar or view him as a ruthless conqueror, and there are good arguments on both sides, the military reality of Alesia is undeniable. He was outnumbered, cut off, fighting on 2 fronts, and running low on everything except confidence. And he won. Not through luck, not through overwhelming force, but through preparation, engineering, and the willingness to take a risk so enormous that his enemies could not believe he was actually doing it. That is why Alesia still shows up in military textbooks 2,000 years later, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to your enemy is to let them think they have you exactly where they want you. If you enjoyed this breakdown of one of history's wildest battles, hit subscribe and drop a comment with which ancient battle you want to see covered next. More videos like this are coming every week.